Good morning. It is a privilege to welcome you all here today in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. I'm Emily Mendenhall, and I am welcoming you to this joint lecture funded by the Global Health Policy and Politics group in the O'Neill Institute, and also the Science, Technology, and International Affairs program in the School of Foreign Service. We are so privileged today to welcome Professor Attiya Waris, who was appointed the UN Independent Expert on Foreign Debt, Other International Financial Obligations, and Human Dignity by the Human Rights Council at its 47th session, and took up function in August of 2021. That is remarkable. Attiya Waris is Kenya's first full female law professor and first professor from a religious, ethnic, and racial minority in the country. She is also the only known professor of fiscal law on the African continent. Her original scholarly contribution to this field has been the development and strengthening of the linkages between finance and development through taxation, debt, and illicit financial flows, and the raising of living standards. Professor Waris was in the past the Director of Research for the university, as well as acting Deputy Principal College of Humanities and Social Sciences, as the first female professor to hold both posts separately and simultaneously. She holds several portfolios currently. She's serving as the UN Independent Expert on Foreign Debt and International Financial Obligations under Implications for Human Rights globally, the chair of the Supervisory Board of the Kappa Build Foundation based in the Netherlands, a commissioner on the O'Neill Lancet Commission on Racism and Structural Discrimination and Global Health, and a member of the editorial board of the Yearbook on Economic Determinants at the WHO, while also being the managing editor of the Journal on Financing for Development, which is at the University of Nairobi. Most recently, Professor Waris was quoted in the Constitutional Court of Kenya in the debate on housing tax, but her work was used by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Bahamas, citing her as a legal scholar during the recently conducted G77 meeting in Kampala in January of 2024. She has been a founding member of several organizations, including the African Tax Researchers Network based in South Africa, the Tax Justice Network Africa, and Kappa Build Foundation in Amsterdam, and the Committee of Fiscal Studies at the University of Nairobi, and most recently, the Afrodad East and Horn of Africa. She's also a senior scholar here at the Center for Global Health Policy and Politics, which is of course led by Professor Matthew Cavanaugh, who will be joining us in a second to engage in a question and answer session. We're so lucky to have you here and honored to welcome you to Georgetown University.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here, really. And I have to say that, Georgetown is quite well known for its tax law program. So it's quite nice to be in a space that is so well known for tax as well. I spent a lot of time trying to understand the global financial architecture. And when I was trying to figure it out, one of the things that constantly hit me was the absence of a human voice in the conversation. And so I developed what I call the life cycle approach. And so I'm going to start with that because the life cycle approach is something I spoke about in my report to the General Assembly last year in October. And what I do is I look at the life of a human being from the point when we hopefully plan conception, right? Best case scenario. 2-3 months taking prenatal supplements, all the rest. You know better than me, of course, all the health markers, but I will tell you the few that I do know. And then you have this child being conceived, then you have the child going through gestation, the mother is taking health supplements. Then you have the birth, and you presume you're going to have a childbirth which isn't full of medical bills. If there's a cesarean section, it's covered by the system, right? There isn't maternal mortality, big challenge. And then you follow the life of this child, and then you hope they'll get the vaccines they need on time, if they're going to take them. That's also another conversation, right? That if they have nutritional needs, that there is a food program in the schooling system. If they have medical concerns, they continue to get support, they get educational access. And then fast forward when they enter into the workforce, which is where my space begins in some senses, that they are now economically productive units in this global, national, regional, county level space. And so when you look at it from the perspective of the country level, then you need to make sure that the financial system responds to that human being, to their needs, to their requirements, so that they are ready to then contribute back into the space. But if I layer onto that the financial system we're in, and I start simply with debt, and you can start from different financial spaces, but debt gets housed in two specific places. Either it's going to be public or sovereign debt, which is, the IMF and the World Bank, or it's going to be private debt, and you're going to start talking about investment bankers in different parts of the world. Either way, when that debt gets taken on, the idea is whatever you take the financial support for should trigger economic growth. That 5 years later or 8 years later, whatever you invest in should be paying for itself. And if you think of it in terms of a human being, if you take a mortgage for your house, we presume that you're putting your otherwise rental income into it, and at the end of that period, you own the house, right? So there's this gain that comes out of it. These big debts are usually infrastructure debts, building hospitals, building schools, building roads, going to hospitals and schools, right? And so the idea is that if you invest in it properly, which is a debt, say, from the IMF or from BlackRock, right, to diverse spaces, that entity that you're building will allegedly provide that economic generation. But health is always seen as an expenditure in financial spaces. So to flip it on its head, it will be that you have a healthy population that continues to work and produce and pay taxes and build your economy, right? So if you stop only at the expenditure level, then you fall into that international trap of you don't need to do the health financing part. The challenge that I see in these spaces is that it is still a conversation of expenditure, and it isn't about that healthy workforce that's continuing to build and grow, or that healthy child that isn't going through ADHD or nutritional deficiencies, that is having, brain considerations or mental health issues. And so now you have this layering of this healthy population coming in. And I think sometimes the indicators and the markers miss that in global health, at least from fiscal spaces. And so you now have this debt conversation happening, but you also then have mismanagement of debt, which is a global challenge as well. Conversations around corruption, around misuse of funds, around poor decision making on finance. And then if you throw COVID into the mix, messed up everybody's financial data, which meant that economic trajectories of growth globally didn't happen. So because they didn't happen, those debts that were taken on board didn't produce economic growth that was expected, which means you now have the economically productive people in society paying increased taxes to pay off the debt, right? So now you see the layer of tax coming into the conversation. And then you have the next level of finance, which is aid or ODA, which has also been in the conversation. And you already know that globally this has gone on a reducing balance basis. So there's less and less of this. So now you can imagine a post-COVID world where the financial and economic data now no longer make sense. We cannot figure out what to invest in and produce that will profit. And now you have the removal of additional resources. So the pressure in the system now shifts to tax and shifts to government business. And in developing countries, government business procurement tends to be about 80 or 90% of a country's economy. In bigger economies like the United States, for example, it's about 40%, 20 to 40%. So that balance of power and shifting also starts to play a role in these conversations. So for the longest time, everybody keeps talking about the international financial architecture. And I keep laughing and saying, I think my architecture friends would be very insulted by the use of the word architecture, because there really isn't a system. It's a series of bilateral debt agreements between a country and an entity such as the IMF or BlackRock. And then if you shift onto the other side, tax agreements are also bilateral. However, for the first time in the history of the world, we are negotiating a multilateral tax treaty at the United Nations. So there is this shift in multilateralism now coming about. There are key countries that have withdrawn from the tax convention, specifically the United States. So now you see that multilateral again is not quite multilateral, but let's see, you know, how it goes and where it gets to. If I move you across to debt, debt are still bilateral and debt agreements are confidential. And I often tell people that the reason debt law is so easy to work in is because it's a leakage. The only way I can analyze a debt agreement is if there's a leakage of the debt agreement, and then I can now start doing the legal analysis around it. So these are confidential, so there's no transparency in the space, right? But you also then don't know what it's supposed to be used for. What is it supposed to trigger? What is supposed to be built? What is the expected economic growth that we're supposed to get out of it, so that fast forward 15 years later, when you have to repay the debt, we're not increasing taxes, right? Because remember, I said it has to be self-generating, and if it's not self-generating, then the solution is always landing on tax. It never lands on increased collection of royalties for minerals. It never lands on increase in revenue from telecoms, because many governments own telecom, for example. It always lands on the human being. And so that conversation around the healthcare now becomes even more important, because if that financial burden is going to land on the human being, then if you look at a single country and you ask yourself, do they have health insurance? Is it about out-of-pocket payments, or is there a healthcare system? Then here are the triggers that start to happen. Fewer goods and services in the healthcare system, no medication, doctors on strike, right? Lower pay, high inflation, all of those now start to play a part. The second thing is, if it's health insurance, then people just don't go. And some of the things I've seen in health data is, for example, they will say there are fewer people getting maternal health care in the hospital. And then the question that triggers is, are people having fewer children? But actually what you start to see is more women having births at home. Then you have to ask yourself, but why? And it's because of the bill. And you can track and trace the bill back to, there was a debt agreement, they're defaulting on it, and they've taken away healthcare. And suddenly this mother, this family, is making a decision on where to have their child, not because they don't want to go to the hospital, but because they cannot afford to go to the hospital. And I think for me, this is where the reality hits, because that for me is vulnerability. Women still die giving birth. And one of the things I look at from the health sector always is what's reversible if I can throw enough money at it. And I literally tell people that. Tell me what we can reverse. So just yesterday, I heard a lovely example, I was reminded of a lovely example, for example, of sickle cell. Sickle cell costs $3 million for one person to get the cure. That is my understanding. But you've put a figure on it, so I can help find you the money, right? That's the conversation, and I think that's where the conversation needs to go. So when you're dealing with a person suffering from albinism who needs sunscreen or sunblock, I can tell you how much that costs, and I can tell you where to find it in the system. And so this is where I look at debt agreements, I look at tax systems, and I try to block off what I think is the bare minimum, but I also look at what is preventable. Because what we can prevent is also as critical as what vulnerabilities are as well, right? That healthy population and what that looks like. And so a year and a half ago, I did a report for the Human Rights Council on the social contract. And I talked about the fiscal social contract. And the phrase that is being used in human rights spaces is the human rights economy. But it's human well-being. It's other language to mean absolutely the same thing. But that fiscal contract means a constitutional link between why resources are collected, how they're collected, and what they're used for. And I recently came from Kuwait, and I have to tell you, they don't have income tax. And many people sort of have this sort of mental, I think almost like a breakdown when they hear that there's a country in the world that doesn't collect income tax, right? Because it's like a given, 30% of my salary is going, right? That's like a normal conversation. But I have to tell you that if you don't need to extract the revenue, you shouldn't extract it. right? And I think that that's the starting point of so many conversations. And so even this year, in October, my report to the General Assembly was about financing peace. And the reason it's about financing peace is because we now have financial systems that focus on supporting the manufacture of military equipment, on export of military equipment, on generating revenue from military equipment. And if you have an international financial architecture that allows for it, that allows that transaction to take place, right, for the buying and the selling, then suddenly we're no longer talking about health, we're talking about life and death, right? And so this also for me is a very important layer in the conversation that needs to continue. Humanitarian action and how that plays out. And so one of the conversations that I keep trying to trigger in that space is in international humanitarian law, we talk about the law of war. But where's the law of peace? What's the bare minimum we need to protect? What's the basic that we need to make sure happens no matter what? And for me, privately owned military companies is a real question we need to grapple with. Because of what it does, it maims. It doesn't just kill. It's very strategic. And you can have defense forces, but do you want an industry, right? So there's the thing about protecting health and building it, but there's also the causing the harm element in this conversation that I have. And so I've talked about the IMF and the World Bank, and I've talked about the debt, but there's also the tax convention. And it's been a very hard fought space, even in the terms of reference. And I can tell you that I had to give 2 submissions to the convention secretariat because they wanted to remove the phrase human rights from the conversation on tax. And I kept saying, no, we have to have a language of well-being in it. Because again, why would we ever have a tax convention on how to collect tax if we don't have something to spend it on, right? So what is that spending? And that conversation was really hard fought. Like, we had to do 2 submissions. Other member states had to do submissions. The Office of the High Commissioner had to do a submission, just to make sure that tax didn't lose its connection to what its purpose is for. And I think for me, that purpose and objective conversation is really very important. So this international fiscal architecture, you can see, there isn't an architecture. It's this series of, band-aids on systems and bilateral agreements. But then that takes me to the other element of the international fiscal architecture, which I think is so important, which is that it must be principle-based. And let's talk about principle-based, right? It has to be transparent. We have to be able to see debt agreements. We have to be able to see the data. We have to be able to assess if people are paying what they're supposed to pay, so that we're not getting more and more people doing out-of-pocket payments because we can't afford to provide service in a healthcare system, for example, right? So that element is really critical. Then we have to have accountable systems. Governments should be able to tell us what they're doing with the money, why and how, and where. And I think these conversations are starting to come up more and more across the world for only one very interesting reason. For the past 20 years, I've been part of a global campaign on what we call beneficial ownership registries. And they have just been legislated domestically in countries over the past 2 years. And I'll tell you that a beneficial ownership registry requires countries to know the exact human being who owns the company, that owns the company, that owns the company, right? So these very complex structures of corporations that you see, where you cannot see into the trust and you cannot see into the company and you don't know who's actually profiting, is now ending very gradually but very deliberately. And this allows you to see if people are actually paying their taxes or not, if people are actually part of the system or not. And there's like an honesty that will then come into the system, because poor people, lower classes, even middle class, are not going to take the time to set up a corporation to channel money so that they pay less tax. It's going to be the people with the money who can even afford to set up those systems, right? And so it literally is a financial system that is actually built for the wealthy. And there is a need to start to unpack that conversation more and more. And then that takes me to currency fluctuations. There is no single space to guide currencies. There is no single space to decide on what the value of a currency is. If I was to ask you what is the most valuable currency in the world right now, I don't know what you're going to think about, but it's the Kuwaiti dinar, which is like over $3 to the dinar. Who's used to saying that? You know, $3 to the dinar. Like, that's like a reverse thinking almost, right? But then the question becomes, if there are these strong currencies, what is holding them up? How are we holding them up? And then I'll tell you, we don't have the financial data that shows. We don't have the monetary policy that shows it. We just have what looked like a series of, honestly, gentlemen agreements, because there were no women in the room at that point in time, okay? Gentlemen agreements on how they were going to value these currencies and place them. And so if you start to see all of these issues, then I'll bring you down to the last issue before, I'd really like to hear what you think, and I hope I've triggered some thoughts, which is the whole issue of then what happens when there's a dispute and what happens when there's a disagreement. And this year has been really interesting for the entire world because all agreements in trade were withdrawn and cancelled with one statement from one global leader. So suddenly you have 190 plus countries scrambling to renegotiate an agreement. So where do you go to dispute it? Where do you go to renegotiate it? There is no space. And then I'll add to that. If you have a debt agreement with the IMF and you're disputing the repayment schedule or you want a restructuring, where do you go? Nowhere. You go back to the IMF, where the IMF staff will decide if they're willing to have the discussion. And when they agree to have the discussion, they sit and judge on it. So you're going back to the same people giving you the money to ask them to restructure, and then they're going to sit and decide, and you have to present your case back to them. There is no neutral space. There isn't even the pretense of a neutral space for it. And so if you come back down to all of these global demonstrations across the world, I think the most recent was Madagascar. We've had Bangladesh, right? We've had demonstrations in so many countries, and these are all connected to finance. But they're connected to finance because people are feeling the pain. The price of eggs has become a conversation in some of the wealthiest countries in the world, including here in the United States. So this conversation is critical to survival, to nutritional needs, to a balanced way of life. And while I want to end by saying I'm not a health specialist, I lean on the health specialists that I engage with, because they're the ones that tell me where the pressure points are. And then I look to see how the structure or the absence of a structure in the system is really undermining all of this. So I thank you very much for your time.
So thank you very much for being here, Attiya. And as Emily said, welcome to Georgetown, and we're so glad to have you with us. So I want to kick it off, and then we'll open it to others that want to come in.
Okay.
I've got only 24 questions for you, so it's fine. No. Let me start off with a very health-based question, which is, there has been, we're sitting in Washington. The administration has made massive cuts to the aid infrastructure that exists out there.
Yeah.
And I think the global health world is really grappling with what to do about that, how to think about that, what to understand is the way forward.
Yeah.
And we've ended up with what I would argue is a kind of facile conversation about, well, domestic resource mobilization. And the conversation, I think, especially within conversations in Geneva, where I know you spend time, I spend some time, end up being as if low and middle income country governments just haven't had the political will to invest more in health. And now that there's been aid cuts, the solution is they just have to decide to invest more in health, right? And so a lot of investment and time has gone into, how do you build pressure? How do you have conversations? How do you have these technical pieces? But you're describing something where you didn't even mention aid as you were talking, right? So you're describing something really different. So how do you think about this piece, this idea that in global health gets called domestic resource mobilization, which I think is kind of agnostic as to where it might come? how do you think about that conversation about aid and the retreat of aid and what's needed now and what global health needs to know?
Okay, so I'll tell you that in 2009, I sat on the OECD's Task Force on Tax and Development. And we set it up because of insane pressure from civil society to sort of reconfigure the tax system, because it was really non-existent. It was a lot of strong arm tactics, often with offers of military aid to get stuff up and running. And even in 2009, the conversation was that tax was going to result in the end of aid. And we could see it in the financial spaces, but I could see that other sectors were not seeing it. And so we now end up setting up what was then called the OECD's two-pillar solution, 15 points on the types of tax systems that need to be rejigged. But the entire conversation was around domestic resource mobilization. And so this push for how to increase domestic resources did not recognize, for example, the fact that a global corporation pays taxes only in one country, the country where it's headquartered. And these are these series of double taxation agreements that you see across the world. And so when we continued pushing, I represented the Tax Justice Network Africa, which I also helped found. I represented them during the course of that process. And then when we came out of it, now you had a very technical secretariat coming out and pushing these conversations around DRM. And domestic resource mobilization simply means taxation. It doesn't go beyond taxation. But what became very evident is, and this has continued to date, is that the IMF and the World Bank continue to push for indirect taxes. So then came the pushback. So in Kenya, there was a fantastic campaign where we asked for the zero rating of sanitary pads, because you're paying taxes for something that's a necessity. But the tax on it was a value-added tax, which was a tax on luxuries. So you can see like this disconnect, right, in where they're collecting from. And then I had a look at baby formula. I started to look at nappies, and I realized that babies are paying taxes, right? I mean, that's the conversation. Then if I look at the price of a syringe, and syringes have a VAT on it as well, then giving a child a vaccine with a syringe means, again, you're ascribing it to the child. And if I come across to countries like the United States, I believe the first mail, that a mail meaning, letter, sorry, but the first letter or mail is a bill from the government for the child's birth. I mean, this is really bizarre. Like, this is a child that has barely started breathing, right? But this is domestic resource mobilization. And this is the explanation of domestic resource mobilization. And so then began my push through the health sector, because I noticed that the health sector is always the quickest to pick up on stuff, right? So I start having conversations in the health sector, and I'm telling them, well, we're unlocking strategies of finance, but who's taking it up? But I am seeing VAT, and VAT is not going to work in any country in the world when it comes to issues around health and education, for sure. And nutrition. So in health, for me, I include the underlying determinants of health, right? So we need to make sure that there is this protection in this space to keep people going. But that voice is really lost in the conversations. And so it's really important for the people working on health to not look at climate for the solution. Because here's the other thing. So climate's like positive example is the tobacco tax. But for people in finance, tobacco tax has been a failure, because I will tell you that who stopped smoking? Okay, the people who can't afford it, fair enough. How are we helping the people who were addicted to it? We're not. We're actually just producing more and different and diverse products. I mean, people have patches, people have gums. I mean, it's like, I can't keep up, right? So you now have a situation where you've sort of redirected an economy or an industry, but you actually haven't solved the problem of, throat cancer or mouth cancer. I don't see money going into those fields. And so this is why when I come into spaces which talk about health, and I love this because this is like a multidisciplinary space, but the health people cannot take on things like a tobacco tax or a carbon tax, because that's putting you into a block, And the rules and guidelines around those taxes are either that it's a sin or that it's supposed to redirect the way people behave. But it's not revenue generating, and it's certainly not going to then be redirected. It just goes into the national pot. So what we need is, if you're going to collect finances from a national pot, then you need to spend it accordingly, which is why I now talk about things like military expenditure, because you have to redirect. The financial advocacy around the world in creating a semblance, which has been fairly successful, and more successful than most areas currently, has got us to a position where we can actually identify the money, but we need to make sure that the people that need the money ask for the money and prevent requests for the money from coming from spaces that will then harm people. So that's my DRM take. And DRM also excludes global businesses, because remember, you're paying tax in the country where the company is headquartered. And that's why this tax convention is also really critical for people working in health, because we need to make sure that the tax is shared equally and where it belongs. And I think that rejigging, because there's like whole conversations there around formulas, for example, the rejigging of those formulas are going to be critical. And there's a pollution treaty that's gotten stuck. There's like the climate fund that's empty. There's the loss and damage fund that's also empty. But there's also the pollution treaty that's stuck. And they're all stuck, including pandemics, on the formula of the finance. And all of these have serious health impacts. And so for me, this is where you can really bring together people in raising that conversation into a global level and not keeping it down in the domestic spaces.
So I hear two things in that answer. So let me push you. One, health people are very excited about health taxes.
Yeah.
This is like, I think in this town, in the last 2 months, there have been no fewer than 5 different events.
Oh, wow.
Very excited about health taxes. And so I hear you saying these are not a great idea, health people. So talk to us a little bit more about that. And I think the conversation in part has been that I think there is some evidence, right, that you've seen through taxation reductions in certain behaviors, right?
Yes.
And so people are seeing that as both a way to do, exactly as you say, to do revenue mobilization, but also as a way to kind of point people toward health. So say a little bit more about your critique. You kind of started there and said that you didn't like that as a way forward, but tell us a little bit more about why, and does it really raise no money?
So the thing is, it raises money, but it doesn't mean it's going to get targeted to health. So you'll get the revenue collection, but then the government will turn around and say, but this belongs to the communal pot. And we get to then decide how we're spending it. So they could just spend it on staff salaries. They could, set up another embassy in another country. Like these taxes have to be earmarked if you want it to be successful. So if you do something like the tobacco tax, and so for example, there's been like sugar taxes. There's been lots of conversations globally around sugar taxes since I think 2016 onwards. And I'll tell you that in many countries across the world, poor people are going to put 2 spoons of sugar into their tea, or 3 spoons of sugar into their tea. And you're going to be horrified, right? Because you're like, oh my God, that's so unhealthy. But guess what? They're not going to have lunch. And they're not going to have dinner. And sugar is the energy they need to keep going. So then the solution is, so this is the tweak that was happening around 2016 when those debates were happening, whether, okay, we'll put a tax on the soda companies. And I was like, no, but again, that's an energy source. Like literally in developing countries, half a loaf of bread and a bottle of soda is what poor people consume. And then if they're lucky, it'll be a hot drink, which is a tea, not usually a coffee, right? But a tea with loads of sugar again. So do you put the tax on the loose sugar? No, clearly not. Do you put it on the refined sugar? No. If you put it on the company, they drop it down to the consumer. So then you have to do a combination. You have to do price control, and then you have to put the tax in. because by putting in the price control, it means that the person at the bottom doesn't suffer, but you're reducing the profitability of that particular company. But nobody puts in price controls. People seem almost afraid of price controls. But you have to think seriously about what is that basket of goods and how do we make sure that people are not struggling. And I keep remembering the price of eggs here. The price of eggs in the US was just like all over the place, right? And I see some people nodding. Okay. So
It was.
So what if we put a tax on that? Then we are in trouble. We've had onion riots in India because of a shortage. We've had corn flour demonstrations in East Africa because of an absence of price control. And the thing is that the strategy that countries use instead of putting price control is to remove the tax or put the tax. But why are you benefiting? Because that's the end consumer that's affected. And that's why I don't like sugar taxes, because it doesn't think through who's actually going to pay. And I haven't seen successful sugar tax. I haven't seen successful health taxes in place. And I remember even pollution taxes, like the carbon tax, everybody talks about the carbon tax a lot as well. But it just simply gets directed to that household budget. And I don't think that that's fair. And I think that that's what needs to be protected. I don't know if that sort of, takes you.
Point is that I know that people would argue that they're regressive, but the argument is that it prices them out so they don't consume it, so people would make other choices.
Yes, except that if you don't price control the other products, then you just starve the person. And I think and we're in one of the worst global financial crises ever. Do not be deluded. This is the worst global financial crisis the world has seen. So can you imagine if they put a price on the sugar, right? And then sugar goes into bread, right? Sugar goes into all sorts of confectionery, right?
But it's usually a price on the beverage.
Yes, but it can also be a tax on the loose sugar.
That's different.
Yeah, so it's about which type of sugar you're putting it on, and then when you do it and you want to redirect the consumption, then you have to make sure that those other consumables are also affordable. So if you want people to have more green vegetables, then you have to allow green vegetables to come into the city without a lot of controls, right? You need to make sure, that burger restaurants are putting one slice more lettuce into the bun, right? There has to be, that trade-off has to be thought about. And what I don't see is that complete thinking of what's the trade-off. Instead, it is we don't want you to do this, but we're not going to tell you what else could be a better option. And I think it needs to be very holistic. And I think this is why I come into this space from like a well-being perspective or a human rights perspective, because I want to see that holistic approach showing itself.
Please, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just feel like I don't completely agree, because
Yes.
I think it's much more structural and political. Like I think that, the increasing privatization and monopolization of products and exports of products
Yes.
in singular or a small collection of products is much more threatening, because people don't have autonomy over the foods. They don't have food sovereignty, like people may have had in the past. In Kenya, in Mexico, everywhere. It's happening everywhere. So the changes in the food people produce and how food is owned and
Yes.
managed is much more. It's much more structural problem. As opposed to an individual problem.
It is, and without a doubt. And I'll have to tell you that tax is very, very political. Always, every single time. And I always argue about the fact that it's always a suboptimal solution. And the reason it's suboptimal is because you're going to take the two parties that are in power in a country, or the three parties that are in power in the country, who their lobbyists are, which companies and which CEOs are supporting them, who's funding their campaigns, and then where the trade-off shows itself. And so that balance is always suboptimal. But that's why I come into the space from how do we protect the human being in those conversations? And you're right, they don't have it. So I'll give you a slightly different example that is still connected to food, but is to do with the African continent. 90% of the carbohydrate sources for Africa come from off-continent. Rice, wheat and corn. Okay? The current global debate that is currently frozen because the US blocked it together with Saudi Arabia is actually the conversation about a tax on ships of 25,000 tons and above. And here's where, again, where the price control thing needs to be played with or manipulated at the same time. They were going to put a tax on all maritime operations, right? More complicated than that, but just for us, this is how it is. And so by putting a tax on it, the immediate effect is going to be on goods coming in. And some of the goods coming in include sugar, because when you have a shortage, things come in from abroad. So back to the sort of sugar tax conversation, but also to carbohydrate sources. 90%, which means that 90% is going to be affected in that household budget of food products. So how do you protect that? And then how do you make sure? And if you throw into that conversation the fact that we have a global financial crisis where inflation is out of control, right? Then what you see is currency fluctuations, and when goods land, buyers cannot even afford to pay for it, right? And then if I throw in the example of Sri Lanka, where at a certain point in time, vehicles were like stalled on the roads because they ran out of fuel, because they couldn't even get fuel into the country, right? Then what you have is a situation where even if you have the food at the port, it cannot move. And it just rots at the port. Like, these are real dilemmas, and these are real dilemmas globally right now. So then if you look at the exporter of the item, because these are just the recipients, right? So let's look at who's making wheat, who's making soya beans, because that's a US conversation right now. Then if you don't have good negotiations that are solid and stable, then it's not even about people consuming. It's actually about people buying and vegetables rotting on the farms because there's no market for it. And that's where your tax becomes more complicated. And where when you start saying that this is healthy or that is not healthy, then you will either trigger the economic demise of an entire industry, or you'll be able to support it. And so it's such a balance. Like it's not even a seesaw. It's like that little merry-go-round that moves in different directions, and you have to keep it in balance all the time. And it'll never quite work. And it'll always be awkward and uncomfortable. So I hope that sort of helps you go a little bit more into where I'm thinking.
Yeah, but I think the sugar tax is very rarely on like a bag of sugar. It's almost always on a beverage.
Now, but in 2016 when we were debating it, it was on loose sugar. So that was so I was giving you the historical background to when the conversations were starting and how they were starting. And even if it's on the beverage, it still has an effect on low income earners. Because when I look into your restaurants here that sell burgers, it comes with a soda. Like I see bottomless soda. I see these are concepts even here. But I don't see this in other countries. And I think nutritional benefits of food is something so critical in today's world. And then learning disabilities that come with it as well. So I'm not the health person, but I feel like there isn't that holistic protection of it in that conversation. So yeah.
So let me ask a different question and then open it up as well. So what's the better idea? So and I think this point that Emily is making and others, like this is deeply complicated when it comes to the kind of syntax piece.
Yeah.
And so but fundamentally, I think the second part of my question was, you're telling us it's not raising very much money. And so what are the alternatives that might be able to fund health in different ways?
Okay, so it does raise some revenue, but the thing is I think the problem is, the phrase is what we use as tax incidence. It's from whom it raises. So you still have a growing elite and you have an inequality. But I will tell you that for me, the solution is very clear. We have illicit financial flows going across the world, which is basically the system of people doing tax avoidance, tax evasion, and what we call aggressive tax planning. And so what I see in that space is that there is a complete lack of track and trace. You will see the first transaction, you'll not see the second or the third or the fourth. So you don't know where the money lands. But I'll tell you, you can walk on a street and people will tell you, oh, these are all the tax evaders in our country. Here they are living in this high net worth individual, part of our cities. And people know this. And you can talk to people. If you go to other parts of the world, like I think Norway it is, they actually have public records on what taxes people pay. And then people actually sort of report on each other, which is also interesting for different countries and different peoples and communities. But it is billions of dollars that is moving without any track and trace. And the Bank of International Settlements, which is a private company housed in Zurich, has all the traditional banking data. So we can find it. We know where to find it, right? And if you even put a 0.1% transaction tax on it without questioning whether the money is legal or illegal and just, taxing the transaction, the maths is incredible. You can see huge amounts of money and you don't have to think about it. That's one. The other space that is super critical right now is taxation of digital companies. They have escaped taxation because they have argued that they needed the support in order to grow. But they are now massive. I mean, the biggest foundations in the world are connected to former owners of big digital companies. The question is, and I think this is it's the trade-off question, is do you allow an industry to make so much profit that they now want to give back? Or do you just tax them so that you allow the government to decide how the give back takes place, right? This is the corporate social responsibility argument versus let's tax them and collect from them honestly, and then let's fit it into the national development plan. And I know that, for example, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation originally became very controversial in health because they immediately focused on HIV, TB, and malaria was added on later. But the question became, and this was happening in developing countries, was you would have an HIV lab next to the normal lab, and then the normal lab was a mess and the HIV lab would be state of the art. But how do you deal with that disparity, right? And how do you make sure that these financial expenditures are fitting into the national development plan? And it's because you have to use taxation for it. So if you want to talk about domestic resource mobilization, then shouldn't that funding have gone into the state and allowed the state to decide what was its priority? But again, that additional layer of the problem in the financial system comes up because if there was corruption or leakage in the financial system, including national budgets, once you see the first transaction going out of the country, you don't see it again. So Switzerland is famous. There was the Swiss leaks, right? You had numbered accounts. There was scandals on Nigeria because for Sani Abacha, till today, nobody's quite sure how much money was out there because he kept the numbers in his head, right? Then you have Hosni Mubarak, who was doing huge transactions out of the country days before he lost power in Egypt into Switzerland. And then this was the celebrated part by Switzerland. They're like, oh, we received the transaction and we froze it. And I actually questioned them about it. I said, but why did you allow the transaction into your country? Because here's the other part. The moment the transaction lands in your country, then it has to go to a court case in the home country. They have to win the court case. That's going to take like 4 or 5 years. Then it's going to come into the other country where you have to do enforcement of foreign jurisdiction law, where they have to go through the data all over again and see if the evidence validates it, and they can still decline. And then they're going to release the money. On average, it takes 15 to 20 years before money gets returned through illicit financial flow transactions. And this was a scenario where Switzerland actually said, yes, we have it, and we froze it. And then you only get the principal. You don't get any revenue or interest from the money. So you lost the use of the money. The other country gets to use the money, but doesn't have to give you any revenue it makes from the use of the money. I mean, that is rather strange.
Indeed.
Yeah. And if I look at my fiscal legitimacy principles, there's the fairness issue. Where is the fairness in that? And I think that we need this principle-based system desperately.
And what kind of what's the volume of what that illicit financial flows how do we think about that in the kind of fiscus of a country, an African country?
Well, so for Africa, they say it's between 50 and 90 billion leaving every year. Per year.
I don't know off the top of my head, but I think the Global Fund is like 2.
Yeah.
So maybe
Yeah.
there's an interesting alternative.
Yeah.
Let me open it to the
Yeah.
to others who are in the room and see what questions and thoughts you've got. Siona?
I have a question about, you spoke a little bit about the role of sovereign debt, but I'm curious about how you see the relationship between a country that holds the spending of their health budget to 15% of their total budget. What's the relationship there between debt and DRM?
So the Abuja Declaration and the 15%, right? So only 5 countries, when I checked in about 2019, actually hit that 15% amount, and Kenya was not one of them. But Rwanda was one of them. And I actually then did an analysis during COVID to see what response rates were. And you could see that the countries that had spent the 15% actually were having a better health response than the ones that hadn't. And that really was very interesting for me. But I'll tell you that if you have a loan agreement with the IMF currently, then there are conditionalities. And those conditionalities include tax conditionalities. So from whom you collect, how you collect, has a direct impact. So one of the current conversations I hear, and I remember, so I'm going to give you incidences in the past as well. So in 2016, for some strange reason, I was in India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Kenya, Uganda and Tanzania, and Rwanda. Sort of, I was doing this like research trip through these countries. And for some reason, I kept getting there just before the IMF team or after the IMF team. And I'll tell you that they kept implementing a 16% VAT just after the IMF team was leaving. And I kept thinking, why 16% VAT? Like, and then I go away. And then I come back and I go into another country and it's 16% VAT. And I'm like, there is something sort of strange in this rhythm. And then I discovered that that was the rate that they were recommending. And they were recommending it as a blunt rate. They weren't even recommending it as a mixed rate for mixed goods, because then that's a complicated system for the country. But why not then just ask for a sales tax? Because here's the other thing about value added tax or VAT, is that there'll be an input tax and an output tax. So if I take a medication that is coming in, if it is brought in bulk and then packaged into small boxes, it attracts a 16% VAT. If the box is then broken into smaller pieces and sold loose, it's attracting another level of VAT. So these are layers of 16% being added onto the same item. And the maths that I calculated was that on average it was doubling the price of those goods. Okay, but the manufacturer, the retailer, the wholesaler doesn't pay it themselves, they offset it. We bought envelopes to put the pills in, and we paid VAT for the envelopes, so we offset. And it trickles and it lands on the final purchaser every single time, who doesn't have the advantage of being registered as a VAT provider, so actually now absorbs the cost, right? And this was recommendations from the IMF and the World Bank. And there have been subsequent reports by the IMF that came out that said that they wanted to reverse that conversation and the decision. But in reality, these loan agreements are 15, 20-year agreements. These conditionalities are embedded within. And every time you hear the leadership of the IMF or the World Bank speaking, you hear these two conversations. You hear, yes, VAT works. But actually, what would work is income tax. So only 1% of adults over the age of 18 in Senegal pay income tax. Isn't it better that we tax them? Even if they're going to declare a 0% tax, put them on your tax system. Develop your social contract, right? But at the moment you have the agreement on debt with the IMF, you lose your agency as a country to develop your tax policy. So fast forward last year in Kenya when there were demonstrations were not against the government. The demonstrations were against the IMF. And people died. So can you imagine like you are making conditionalities that is squeezing people to the point where they cannot survive. And these are the conversations that I want to hear in this international financial architecture that I try and talk about, is where is that consideration? And the IMF and the World Bank will consistently tell you that we are not human rights mandated, which means that we don't have to think about it, we don't have to roll it out. And they will answer to this. A couple of months ago, myself and a couple of rapporteurs wrote to the IMF. Again, like this is like a repeated conversation we have with them. And we asked them, what is your human rights mandate? The answer is very clear. We do not have a human rights mandate. But they belong inside the UN system. They are in the UN system. Anybody draws an organogram of the UN in a first year class in university, they are in it. So how can you be in it but not in it and not be guided by the UN Charter, right? And Article 2, right? So these are the conversations I think that are really critical, which the world is grappling with right now. And I'm going to add another layer. The United States has veto power at the IMF, just like it does at the Security Council. And so that means that debt agreements have the oversight of the United States. Isn't that another conversation, to start having?
It is.
So, yeah.
Yeah, no, this has been really helpful. I actually come from the health side.
Okay.
And so I actually understood a lot of what you said, which is very helpful. You put it in a very understandable kind of framing, so thank you for that. I think because I'm coming from the health side, and because I work primarily with a number of different ministries of health, what I often hear from ministries of health is, especially in the current environment where you've got an overall resource envelope that you work with is much smaller. Like even advocating for the priorities they feel are priorities gets very challenging intergovernmentally. So even in kind of advocating with their treasury or Ministry of Finance, I think sometimes they just, what are those data points? You talked about sickle cell earlier, for example, like how much does it cost? I've seen costing for multiple things. I work primarily in maternal and newborn.
Okay.
And costing is all over the place in terms of how we cost those interventions. And so even in communicating the costs, you're not always comparing things that are quite comparable, if you will. And so I guess, I don't know, just as you're talking, I think you're bringing up very important issues about, kind of the different kind of players that need to be at the table talking to each other. But I think I'm struggling a little bit with the realities of they already do not share a language, a same language, or a way to talk to each other. And so I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on ways forward, because I do think that seems to be a very practical stumbling block. And I even think about, you've mentioned IMF. I have less experience with IMF, maybe a little bit more with the bank, and talking to Ministry of Health colleagues who actually get very frustrated in their conversations with the bank, because again, it's a language issue. Like there are certain conditionalities imposed on them, but I don't think they fully appreciate or understand the implications of some of those conditionalities as the negotiations are taking place. And so it'll come back to this shared language and understanding and how we move forward, working across sectors.
So let's have a conversation about the human beings in the room, right? And I think that this is one of the political challenges that I see. And it's a controversial issue, because you can have a 7-year political cycle, you can have a 5-year political cycle, you can have like a 30-year political cycle, right? Depending on what part of the world you come from. And I'll tell you that one of the biggest challenges I've seen is when we do trainings, for example, of staff in ministries of health or ministries of finance, and then they get rotated, right? Or you have a change of the political regime, and then all the training you've done is suddenly put aside because it's a different way of thinking, right? And things that were halfway through are then abandoned. And one of the arguments I make in my life cycle approach is actually maybe we need to reconsider the duration of a political cycle. Like maybe it needs to be a little bit longer, just to make sure that things that start can be completed, and the government that takes on like a debt or a certain type of tax system to achieve certain ends, better healthcare, actually can be held responsible for it, right? And I don't know the answer to that, but if you start to build a hospital and then you haven't finished the hospital, and then a new government comes in, and then they will turn the hospital into, I don't know, a volleyball court, or a conference center. This has actually happened in countries like across the world, right? So these are not like unknown examples, but it's because of that decision. But that health center or hospital that was needed then doesn't fulfill the purpose, right? And this is where I think national development plans need to have serious buy-in across political regimes, right? So that's super critical. But then you also need to make sure that they're rolling it out. So those human beings on the ground have to be empowered to a certain level. But I will tell you, I mentioned specifically about the understanding of health as being an expenditure. But health is not an expenditure because then you can't have a healthy workforce. And the language that a Ministry of Finance will understand is that your sick population is not going to be economically productive. And if we can remove, for example, medicines out of revenue generation for the state, then suddenly that can be a question mark for them. So no taxes on anything to do with food or medication, because you need that healthy population, right? Suddenly you'll have your Minister of Finance rethinking, because he's not going to turn around and say, because you're going to turn around and say, you know, an unhealthy population is not going to generate revenue. Then they're going to say, no, we'll just get the tax from the medicines, right? So this byplay requires like serious societal engagement in what I call, what is this basket that we need to protect completely. And so then you just throw out purchasing power parity, you throw out all of those other very technical financial issues that ministries of finance don't really care about. And you just say, here's your healthy population that's going to help you pay your debt off. That's going to help you generate taxes to pay for your salaries, to help you build that next school or hospital, so you can win the next election. And I think it's that conversation that I find is like an incomplete conversation. I don't know if it helps you, but that is how I deal with ministers of finance when I have to talk to them about health-related issues and population-related issues. But I find that the health sector doesn't have the language yet.
They don't.
So, and I think this is the language. I don't know if it resonates with you, but it does with me.
There was a report, I think McKinsey, the World Economic Forum, a couple of years ago, that McKinsey, that's getting some traction in kind of talking about kind of health as kind of, you know, the economic return of health, if you will, but perhaps not as much as, I think that language has certainly not permeated. But I think the other issue for health is, given so many countries are very decentralized, so monies are spent in a very decentralized manner. What you find in many countries, there's still, like, even the money that's being allocated right now, a lot of it gets returned to Treasury because it hasn't been spent.
Yes.
Kind of. So then that puts them at that much more of a disadvantage for advocating for more resources.
And yes, and then the next time you ask, you're given less than, because you didn't have the spending power, right?
Yeah.
But this is the part that I think health ministries need to seriously figure out. And I've noticed human rights spaces have a similar challenge, which is that, you know, you can still spend 3 months after the end of financial year, but I find that often they don't know that. And I think it's that knowledge of a principle-based system that needs to be sort of inculcated into people, so that they know where's that margin when we can still spend. What will be our priorities? When should we not send staff on leave, right? So that they're there to deliver that last mile before we move on. But I also think that, and I spent, so the people who I did this grant with will probably know. So I spent like 4 or 5 years with a group working on universal health coverage under the European Commission. And I'll tell you that I spent 3 years just sitting and listening and watching people working in health fight over what was necessary. And as one of the few people working on a financial system in that conversation and how to finance universal health coverage, my conclusion was the mess is in the health sector, and you have to take it head on. And you know, if you come and talk to people in ministries of finance or specialists in finance, you can't come and tell me we need Panadol or we don't need Panadol. You have to tell me, do you need the paracetamol or do you not need it? And so my conclusion to that was, we have to put a fixed amount per person, because I couldn't tell. And I get that there is dispute in it, but I think that, and I appreciate that, but I think that the health sector needs to also come up with something concrete so that the finance people have something to work with. Because that was in 2014, 2015, by the time we finished that particular grant. We are now in 2025 and we're no closer to it. And so now I've been working with health specialists for 15 years and I still can't tell you what the answer is. I can just tell you here's the amount to work on, but now I'm going to add currency fluctuations, inflation, all the rest. That's not going to help you, right? And so I think it's a battle between people in the industry over prioritization. And so that's why I keep coming back to what's the bubble that we need to protect and how do we find that minimum? But I cannot find that minimum. People working in health must find and declare that minimum.
It's interesting because let me push you a little bit because I
Yes.
think that's a really interesting, interesting point and an interesting way to think about it. And I think if, following on what you're saying, if we had a set of health ministers here, they would say, of course, but we always need more than we can get. So we are constantly in a state of triage, right? And so I wonder if you have thoughts about, because I think your point is well taken and right, and I think that it's true that we end up in a kind of a messy situation, especially when it's like, different sectors fighting against each other, and right now, you've got kind of most directly things I'm working on right now, you see, huge devastation across the HIV sector. And ministers going, well, okay, what do we actually need to do in that sector, and how do we actually kind of balance that out against everything else? But fundamentally, they are in a zero-sum game. And I wonder what you think it would take to get out of the zero-sum game piece. And is it just about language, to your point? Is it about like how? Is there some way to get the health sector more meaningfully involved in the question of how do we gather the revenue so that the ambition can shift? I don't know if that makes sense, but I think it's this world of like, you couldn't get 10 health people in a room. I can't tell you that we could try, but could you get 10 health people in a room and have them all agree on what the priorities are? I don't know that you could, and that's the difficult work of a Ministry of Health. But even in I don't even know, but maybe even in the richest countries in the world with a universal healthcare system, there's still massive debates over that, right? And so I wonder if that's realistic, and then I wonder, but in especially low resource settings, it feels like it's just massive triage. So is there some way to get out of that?
So the potential solution, which I'm working on, is how to take the conversation out of the expenditure argument. And I don't really like McKinsey's work, but that's another conversation. I find it not very robust, honestly. But let's take people affected by HIV as an example, right? Because we've been also having this conversation for the past couple of days. So when they have their ARVs, then they can work somewhere. Where they're working is an economic productivity. They can pay bills and they can pay taxes. So you need to look and see what do they normally spend and what do they normally generate, okay? Then you have to come and say, okay, and now when they cannot afford their medicines and they're sick, now they cannot earn this revenue, then you cannot collect an income tax from it, right? They cannot buy these goods and services, so they cannot pay VAT on that. And the reality on the ground is they stop consuming. So they stop being consumers, but then they stop being economically productive for Ministry of Finance. And you have to put a mathematical value on that. And then when you go back into the ministry and you have to say, well, here's what we would have spent on ARVs, and then here's what we've now lost because we didn't spend it. And the math may not balance if you only use it for like a year. So you have to then see over the next 5 to 10 years, if this person continues to not have it, then what do you have? And then it starts to become serious because then the person may pass away. So you're now losing what kind of economic generation? And that is how you move away from that expenditure argument. And you can do this for absolutely anything. And this is why, for me, the life cycle approach, and the Office of the High Commissioner actually already adopted my life cycle approach. It's already up on their website, which is awesome. I wish they would footnote me, but anyway, that's another academic conversation. But it's there. And so you can actually grapple with that, and you can turn around and say, for example, if this child didn't get good nutrition and now has childhood stunting, because that's the other one that is reversible, right? Like with maternal mortality, then can you imagine what they would have been generating? And now they cannot. If this woman didn't die giving birth to her child, what would be her work? And then the whole unpaid care conversation comes in as well, right? Because even with HIV, we've had generations of grandmothers looking after grandchildren, right? Across villages in my continent, right? And I'm sure in other parts of the world as well. And so if you can put the maths on it, that is great. And then if I look at, so Kenya has this wonderful, I love my country, it's awesome. Kenya has this great thing called the Wanjiku, who's the common person. But the common person is a woman. And her name is Wanjiku. Of course, the name is a little bit controversial because we have many different ethnicities. But this woman is over the age of 18, has 2 to 4 children, has a small kitchen garden, and that is how she survives. And she's a single mother, right? That's the definition of a common person. And she will sell her vegetables in order to buy the school uniform or the books for her children to go to school. But she finished high school. That was the common woman, common person like 15, 20 years ago. So if you use that as your benchmark, and then you ask yourself, well, how much tax is she paying then? And how much should she be paying or not paying? And then what happens if she gets sick? I mean, nobody's extrapolated what that common person looks like and what happens when they fall below the minimum, right? And when they become under threat. And I think it's like a whole area of research, because that's the kind of stuff that a minister of finance will understand. Yeah. And when I have those conversations, they do. Yeah.
I think we have like a minute or two more for a few more questions. If there's one last burning thought, go for it.
Okay, I want to continue the thoughts on debt and maybe a bit more about bilateral debt, which you briefly mentioned as well.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about, on the solution side of things, what you see the role of transitionary tools like financing mechanisms being to maybe cancel bilateral debt. I'm very curious about the possibility of debt swaps, but I know there's a lot of skepticism around how much they can do. But I think, yeah, I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay. So debt has actually gone through a bit of a shift, and I'm feeling very positive about. If you're looking for positivity, come talk to me. I have little pockets of joy. So the world has agreed that they're going to set up a debtors club. There wasn't one before. So I'm hoping that it'll come and it'll move forward really fast, because all of these different countries with different economies don't actually talk to each other about the kind of loan conditionalities they get, the type of interest rate they're paying. And I think like economies should be paying similar interest rates, but you cannot see a rhythm in the IMF system on what are like and what are not like. Again, a problem with the data. But there was a global campaign in 2000, and there is a global campaign again on debt cancellation. And I am fully for debt cancellation with a twist. The problem with debt cancellation is that government then immediately will then take the next debt. And that has been the historical trend across the world. But there is one example which is absolutely fabulous, and it involves the United States and Germany. And after World War II, they were supposed to pay reparations, so they went into debt to pay the reparations and, right, to do a lot of other stuff. And when they did it, they were going to go back into debt again, right, further debt. And what the United States agreed was that any US companies operating in Germany, instead of paying tax in the US, would pay taxes in Germany. So what do you have? You have the clean slate and then a little bit of a push, right, of revenue generation. And that's what you need. And I think that in between the tax convention that's being debated and the conversations around debt cancellation, hopefully with the debtors club, coming in, there's a real possibility of having that global process actually happen if it happens in tandem, where you have the cancellation and then a fair sharing of the resources. So you may not even need a country to do a favor, like, right? You can just have countries say, okay, you just collect what belongs to you. So if you have a digital company and they're all paying their taxes, then the users of digital systems in every country in the world that is generating revenue for the digital company pay the taxes in the country where they are generating revenue. That will allow for that fair share. So for me, this is why an international fiscal architecture and having a conversation around it becomes so important. Because if we do it and we time it nicely, then it'll actually give the world the jump start that it needs. Yeah.
Debt swaps, yay or nay?
Nay. I think it can work. And it's quite funny because when I have meetings with ministers of finance, they always say, yes, Attiya, we know you don't like them, but okay, we have to do this. So how do we do this, right? So that's the most important part. So my biggest challenge with debt swaps is that the formula is always unbalanced. And you'll have forgiveness of, say, 1% interest rate for 1 year for a lifetime protection of a marine area, for example. That's not going to work. That's a completely unequal bargaining space. And the argument that I used actually in the European Parliament was, I said to them that if you want a fair debt swap, then you're going to take, say it's for climate, right? You have to take your car manufacturer and the acreage and the amount of pollution it produces, and you have to mentally move that into that developing country. And then your formula should be, what is the loss of economy you're going to have? Then we're going to have a fair figure. So let's move that car manufacturer into, I don't know, Botswana. Then we forgive the debt, and we measure the loss of economy, and we know the amount that's forgiven. We know the amount we're swapping. And then that other country with whom you're doing that swap should now plant trees in that forest, in that area. That place should become a forest, right? Nobody wants to listen to that argument. But that is the fair formula, right? You give up polluting, you allow the other side to pollute, we cancel the debt, and the value is what you've already polluted in the past.
I like it.
I'm controversial.
Indeed. Well, on that great note, please join me in thanking Attiya Waris for joining us here at Georgetown, and a huge thank you to you. Good luck in what's to come in the work that's ahead, and I hope that this is the kind of start of a set of conversations here at Georgetown and in other spaces about kind of how we do bring the health world together with the very serious finance world, together with the human rights world, in something that pushes the boundaries. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, everybody.